A people who spread terror throughout Europe, killing, stealing, occupying, and destroying. They were called predatory and bloodthirsty wolves. Muslims confronted them in the strongest historical battles, the legend of the Vikings from beginning to end. History is full of legends in many civilizations, such as the Pharaonic and Greek civilizations, but there are some civilizations that were described as being very terrifying, including the Mongols and the Vikings. The worst people in all civilizations were the Vikings, and the Viking Age is considered one of the most mysterious eras in history because they were a people who had no people. There was no capital or a cohesive kingdom to rule them. The Vikings were considered brutal warriors who were known for their strength and thirst for blood. They fought barbarically without any feelings. They killed and robbed young and old and destroyed anything that stood in their way. This mighty people became famous for their professionalism in shipbuilding and experts in sailing. This people lived for a period of approximately 400 years, the 7th century until the 11th century in northwestern Europe, and they lived in small tribes. Each group had a master who ruled them, and their societies were divided into 3 classes as follows. The first class consisted of kings, nobles, and the wealthy. The second class was called the free class and consisted of farmers and merchants. As for the third class, it was considered the worst class, which was the slave class. The Vikings caused many invasions and wars in order to satisfy their desires for treasures, food, and even slaves to sell. Their official language was the Old Norse language, which is known today as the Old Germanic language. The Vikings were a pagan people who sanctified many gods, and their most famous god was Odin, the god of war, Thor, the god of thunder, and Balder, the god of light. They believed that if one of them died in a war, I will go live with God to live in Valhalla. It is a large hall containing all kinds of food and fine wine inside a great palace in Asgard in the other world. One of the most famous Viking kings is Eric the Red. He was given this name because of his red hair. He was the first to discover Greenland in the year 986 AD. Eric the Red had 3 children, and each of them became kings, the first king. His name is Leif Erikson, and he was the one who discovered the coast of America. The second king, Harald Eriksson, became famous throughout Norway because he achieved many great victories from the many invasions he carried out. The third king is the legendary Ragnar. He was married 3 times and had 6 children. He mentioned that Ragnar's children were the ones who created the largest pagan army to take revenge on the man who killed their father, the English king Ella. Ragnar was, in his beginnings, a simple farmer before he entered the hierarchy of power. He was considered by the Vikings to be one of the greatest kings they had ever encountered. He invaded the island of Lansfar in England and destroyed the church, which was the largest place for teaching the Christian religion. The inhabitants of this island were merchants, and most of them learned from this church. When Ragnar's fleet arrived, they thought they were ordinary merchants, so they were happy, and some of the island's residents went with them. Their job was to collect taxes from the trade ships that came to them. When Ragnar's fleet arrived, they asked them to have some of them come from them, so some of them went to explore the island. When they discovered the island, they knew that its residents were militarily weak. But they were very wealthy, so they decided to invade the island and steal everything. They killed all the people, raped the women, burned the houses, and took some of them to be their slaves. After their destruction of the village, they returned to their land with great wealth, plentiful food, and many slaves without any effort, so they decided to change their way of life from the method of planting and harvesting crops to another method, which was to occupy the islands and plunder their property. Since this incident, the Dark Age of the Vikings began, and they committed huge massacres throughout Europe. After their invasion of all of Europe, their greed, desire, and enthusiasm increased. They were directed towards the Muslims who were under the rule of the Umayyad state, which was called in that era the jewel of the world because it contained the highest knowledge, treasures, and development in all fields, which was ruled by Abd al-Rahman al-Awsat. One day, 10 ships of the Vikings came to Ola, the coast of the city of Lisbon, and that city was not fortified from the seaside because they thought that no one would invade them from the seaside. So the Vikings entered the city to explore it as usual, and after touring inside it, they decided to invade it. But this was a bad and stupid decision. It is true that the city of Lisbon was not ready from the seaside, but it was militarily ready on land, and the Muslims were able to expel them without any major losses. After a while, the Vikings returned with 80 warships, and they invaded it, killed many of the residents, stole the treasures, and remained inside the city for 40 days until they received support from the Caliph Abd al-Rahman al-Awsat, and he sent them an army of his armies. This army confronted the Viking fleet, but the Viking army was victorious against the Muslims for the second time, and the Caliph then sent another army in order to overthrow the Vikings. But they failed again because the Vikings were relying on the method of direct attack and then escaping to their ships again. The Caliph decided to ambush them by sending a squad from the Caliph to prevent them from escaping to the ships. The Muslims were finally able to besiege the Vikings and defeated them, killing 500 soldiers, capturing many soldiers, and destroying 35 ships, and the Vikings fled in fear from the Muslim army, and then the Caliphate sent the head of the Viking prince and 200 heads of another soldier to Tangier and the neighboring cities. Because of this war, the Muslims knew the necessity of having a naval army to guard the coasts, and the Viking fleets knew that fighting the Muslim army was a stupid decision, and they abandoned the idea of invading the Muslims. After that, the Vikings disappeared completely, so people searched for. The reason for their disappearance was the discovery of Greenland by the Vikings in the year 986, led by Eric the Red, and they were not monitored or seen. After these dark years had passed, Hans Rig returned to establish a new colony in Greenland in the year 1721. He searched for the Viking colony in which they were located, but nothing was found except traces of their villages. Their disappearance is considered one of the greatest secrets that has not been solved to this day.